fine. It's
go time. It's
go time.
Go.
We have a dangerous topic on the table, which we literally did not discuss at any level of actual detail.
Pre-show had nothing to do with this, so this is like the Table Talks version for you Toastmasters people. This is the Table Talks version of Do the Work.
Does Terry actually even know what I meant by the title?
No. In fact, I got to tell you what was funny is last week, I think it was, I told Mark Russell, I said, the funny thing is, as preachers, we are all about planning what we're going to do.
But not about this.
But when it comes to do the work, usually that planning is 10 minutes before the show. That's usually what happens.
I think I Chris Emerson it all week long, though.
I think you do, but I don't find out till like 10 minutes before the show.
That's a strategic decision, perhaps some strategery there.
Some strategery.
Oh
man.
Good times. We got 6 people on the internet who actually care about what we say.
Hey, did you check out the new addition to the office right here? Vinyl.
What? Wow.
Yeah. Eagles' greatest hits is on there right now.
Nice.
Yeah.
Hey, for those who are numerologists, it's Tuesday, as Chris Kramer identifies.
Falling one short of the divine. Good job.
Yeah. It's good. Things are good.
I have to drink my coffee cup this way because I don't want people to think that I've actually converted to the CSB.
I, on the other hand, am totally going to shill for a brand.
I love how yours says San Francisco. Mine just says Tennessee on the bottom.
Yeah. I'm curious as to the process.
Why did he give me powder blue for Tennessee? Is that a Titans reference? Because I would have thought orange, Emerson, orange.
I'm going to go with this. Knowing Chris,
yours is a 49ers red. Yours is 49ers red.
I know.
He went NFL teams is what he did.
Yeah, that's what I'm going for. That was like I thought it maybe thinking about kind of near where we grew up, some of that stuff. But this is full on footballing, which is totally fine.
Yep,
totally fine. I'm old school Niners.
I think he's Roger a Texas fan, which makes me laugh. Hey, Shane Scott, be quiet. How about that game last week? Boom, we beat you. All right, let's go on.
All right, so this is the genesis for this conversation, and actually is dangerous on many levels. So Terry's going to get in for the wild ride. We'll see how this goes.
My seatbelt on.
Yeah, I'm going to strap in. A couple of years ago, I read a book by an author that deals with Cormac McCarthy, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, does a lot of westerns and gritty genre stuff, talking about the religious themes inside his writing. Because most of his writing is dark, except there's always a spear or an idea of a theological idea of goodness that he tries to put in there. And so in particular, most folks are familiar with only one of his work, which is called The Road. Post-apocalyptic stuff, dystopian stuff, everything dies. The protagonist holds on to an idea called the fire, which is humanity's goodness, is kind of the theme to it. And so that author that I read kind of deals with Cormac McCarthy in regards to his sacraments, like how he deals with religion. That was super interesting to me. But he also wrote a little piece entitled The Politics of Preaching. Wrote this back in 2016, 2017, obviously dealing with politics in the American political context. And that got me thinking about the intersection of politics amongst preachers and how we handle the pulpit, but not about the American condition. Because there's a couple of really important issues that are really significant for young preachers in particular, because that's kind of our concept for behind this, is like helping young preachers get better, helping us improve ourselves. And I don't think I understood this well at all.
Did you say young peepers? Helping the young peepers?
Young peepers.
Help the young peepers.
They can still read without glasses, so they have young peepers.
Have young peepers.
I didn't really understand this at all. As a convert from outside the tribe, like Mark Russell, a bit of a Gentile amongst the metaphorical Jews. evangelists tend to kind of foot into tribal spaces. Like we get our crowd, we get our people around us, and it's not always as good as it may feel. And someone might say, "Well, I'm off on my own. I don't have a tribe." You may have a tribe of one. You may have a tribe of two. I think it's important for us to understand it on that level and how it can be detrimental to our preaching. But also, we do need to interact with how that then impacts what we say and don't say in the pulpit. Because almost every preacher I know recognizes that though they should preach the entire Bible from the pulpit, we get anxious when we preach some sections of the Bible to some audiences. And so the politics of preaching is a relevant subject for us to dig into. And there's no way we're going to finish it in our half an hour plan. But maybe this is kind of like an introduction of ideas concept. So that's kind of the backdrop. So now everyone gets the pre-show for the show.
I think it's interesting to think about sports analogies sometimes with this. And I think about coaching trees this way, right? That you could trace certain coaches back to a head coach, a certain head coach and his kind of philosophy, and see how that, for instance, you've got Sean McVay, who's at the Rams, Matt LaFleur at the Packers coached under Sean McVay. So there's a connection there. The guy that Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, and LaFleur were all on the same staff. So they're connected. I mean, you have, and what that talks about, and the reason why that's kind of interesting is they share similar offensive philosophies. They share similar styles because of that. And I think that's pretty interesting there, that they have these kind of things in common, if you will. And the same thing ends up happening with preachers. Now, Phil, we've talked about this on previous podcasts. When we first started preaching, we found ourselves kind of in this almost kind of cliques of preaching, and in two different cliques of preaching, by the way, for those who haven't heard that podcast or that show. And that radically impacted the way that we preached early on, and the relationships that we had. There was a time, and we've been open about this before, that if we saw each other out like at a gospel meeting, there would have been some hesitation to actually talk to each other in public because we were in these two radically different camps. I'm not saying we wouldn't, just saying that there was in the back of our mind this kind of thing. So there's no denying that we've been in this before, right? I think it's particularly easier for younger men to get caught up in this because there's a sense of latching on to someone. And for me, I think for you too, this wasn't done for a political purpose or even for gain. It was really done because those were our mentors. Those were the people that
very
helped
often,
us
yes. And we
learn
crave
how to
mentorship,
preach.
even if we don't express it.
Right. It was a mentorship. And those were the first people we called when we had an issue as young preachers. And especially, I think for you, this was the same. But for me, my first two works, there's no elders. I ended up being the de facto leadership a lot of times. I'm 23, 24 years old, and I'm the guy they're looking at. And the most natural thing for me to do before I go into a business meeting where I'm going to be the voice of reason at 24 years old, which, by the way, is really foolish, is I'm going to call somebody older. In my case, it was a direct mentor that I had worked with before. And with you, I think that was part of it, but also other relationships you get close to, they become your mentors. Those are the people, those are your sounding boards. That's natural. That's expected, but then it turns into what you're talking about here.
Yeah. And I think for each of us, we need to like pause, reflect, and kind of narrow down, what's actually taking place there. We all need support, like literally, practically, reasonably. But sometimes we get into a situation where our support is unequal. And that's due to only having a small pool of connections. Generally speaking, you are more likely to get to a better space spiritually with a broad reach around you. And think about it this way. How would it go to have an evangelist from inner city New York come and spend 6 months preaching in the pulpit of a church behind the Pine Curtain in East Texas and not really change his political ideology to become more comfortable to his audience? Same thing, flip the tables around. Take your Texan cultural, East Texas space guy, dump him in Harlem and say, preach like you just preached. Those social dynamics that do branch into our political worldview then impact what and how we preach. And I think it's just super important for us as preachers to do our very best to be aware of it. It doesn't mean that some of the ideologies that exist in the world are bad. Many of them are built on biblical constructs. They're concepts that make sense in the communities they're applied in. But we can really do some great harm to ourselves when we get into those imbalanced situations to where we kind of tilt the whirlwind to one side. It's like we're just going to lean to our cultural space. The gospel is always pushing us out of that cultural space if we let it.
And so when you find yourself in these cliques, like we talked about, they're going to push you in those spaces, even in the politics realm.
Yeah.
So you may be in this one group that's like, and this is what I found myself in early on. You got to preach about homosexuality once a year. You got to have that sermon in your plan once a year. Because that's and I remember being told in the group I was with, being mentored, this whole thing about there's going to come a day where they're going to revoke all the tax benefits to churches and preachers because you preach about homosexuality, right? Like when you talk about politics and how this pushes you and how this, like,
right.
Were you told that? I was told that in my early years. This is going to happen. This is what's going to happen, right?
I'm still being told that, by the way, with the same proviso that it's about to happen.
Yeah, and it's been 20, 23, 24 years at this point. I mean,
right. And look, culture has absolutely shifted around us.
Sure.
Those particular issues are being addressed in different ways across the scope of the United States. And there are cases where individuals preaching has had to adjust to be more effective in the audience. What's interesting, though, in those cases, they're preaching more on homosexual issues, and I use those terms connected, rather than less, but they're being more precise. And Brian's general response to, so what it is some of that. We're kind of dealing also with a mixture of ideas, and maybe we should break that out a little bit.
Yeah.
Because here's the negative to this. Very often, the mentor spaces we choose to surround ourselves with may also be isolated big picture. Like they may have an isolated mindset as well. I think there's some real danger to creating an insular echo chamber of evangelists, and we tend to adopt what we're around, and so you can really get some problems there. And when those 2, 3, 4 tribes start bouncing off of each other, you get needless conflict. Like conflict that doesn't actually need to exist, that causes strife in local churches.
So even with a church, sometimes you have multiple tribes, right? Local congregation, and the bigger, more likely that is. The chances that if you're 7,500 people, that you all feel the same thing versus 230, 300, now we have multiple groups. Those are radically different. You add in, and I know you've experienced this too, Phil, a diversity of things like race and cultural background, and that almost automatically demands there's going to be different tribal thought.
Yeah.
Not just politically, but politically, right? navigating all of that is tough, really tough.
Yeah, and let me add this. There's a slide space in there. In any local church, there are political power dynamics that are inherent to human relationships. These are not intentional divisive attitudes like, we're going to branch out. You have logically and reasonably mature spiritual leadership should and does have a stronger pull on the group. That has to be understood as the young evangelist, because you don't know as much as you think you do about the group, about the community. And so you need to be sensitive to those things. Like, I know what the right thing is. The counterbalance to Terry's early illustration. I know what I'm doing. I've studied this for 4 days straight. Like, I got it all figured out. Like, okay, you have 4 days reading that verse over and over again, but you don't have 35 years of immediate experience with the humanity of the people you're serving within. And so I think there's an edge about that is lost when we're young. That if we can get it quicker and understand it sooner, we're going to be more effective. That also includes some of these issues. Like, if you've got a group that is very accustomed to the didactic style of older preachers, any kind of shift from that is going to seem weird. Like, if you start doing expository sermons, no longer topical sermons, if you don't have a 3-point outline, you're now covering over new hurdles for them. And you've got to understand that when you make those adjustments. Jeremy points out something I think is super important. I want to kind of point that as to learning to read widely. Let me add this. There's two aspects to it. Reading widely isn't just getting books within a narrow band written by authors who have slight disagreement. Like, just because you have 3 different restoration journals on your table does not mean that you have read widely. Nor does it mean reading widely, and I'm pretty sure Jeremy's going to absolutely agree with this. Reading widely means, okay, I've read a Baptist thing, a Lutheran thing, and a Church of Christ thing. Like, that's not it either. It doesn't mean that those 2 steps don't help. But you've really got to get a library of experiences and a library of written work that pushes beyond where you yourself can reach. A typical white male has a difficulty reaching into cultural communities that aren't white male. And if you can't go there personally, and not all of us can, the first step for you is to just reach out to a book written by somebody inside that community to explain it. Getting a book by someone from the outside about that community isn't necessarily the first step. That might be a second step.
And to read it with an open mind rather than a mind that's seeking just to disprove everything in the book. Yeah. Like, I think that's one of the issues is it's not just reading from a bunch of different perspectives so you can prove you're right. It's a perspective of reading to see what you can gain. You're looking to gain knowledge, not discredit authors. Sipe, I quote Wright all the time, man. I love Wright.
Yeah. Hey, BJ, you're a heretic for only reading Wright and Bonhoeffer and not reading far enough out beyond that.
Read some Moog. I just like saying Moog. That's why I throw that in all the time.
Moog's not even risky. Moog's like super conservative in this space.
A little bit. He's got some things he's off on. Come on now. So
everybody's weird, even you.
Yeah, even no, I'm normal. The rest of you are weird. Listen, like you mentioned the diversity angle. Like, I mean, when I moved to Memphis, that was a culture shock, man. Like it's, and you know what's really uncomfortable. Let me give this kind of suggestion to this here. When you find yourself having a large contingency of members with a different background and a different worldview than you need to try to take a purposeful dive into their worldview, an intentional dive into understanding what they are. You need to challenge yourself to see things differently. Mark Russell brings the Gentile talk up. You know what? I think what's funny about that is sometimes with other people, we're kind of like the Jews. We want to turn everybody into Jews, like the Jews did. We want to turn the Gentiles into Jews. We want to make them all go get circumcised. And what we need to do is we need to dive into their culture and understand why they're not, and understand why that's okay, rather than just trying to create, for lack of a better term. Sometimes in the Church of Christ, we want to create our own like line of clone troopers, like in Star Wars, where everybody looks the same way, dresses the same way, acts the same way, believes the same way. You got to resist that urge. You need to get out and try to understand the dark side, using the analogy, joke around a little bit, but you need to understand the other side of things from where you're at, rather than just constantly criticizing anything you don't necessarily agree with. So, like when it comes to race, go read Conversations with a Black Man, right? And read it with an open mind and try to learn something, rather than just automatically discrediting everything it says because it's not your worldview. You need to have that experience.
Yeah, and I would admonish people to use that as a stepping stone to cross 2 more bridges. The next bridge is to actually have conversations with a Black man.
Correct.
And then have actual conversation with a Black man where the Black man is being transparent and honest with you.
Let me tell you how you do that. You bring the Black family into your home.
Yeah.
And you welcome them into your home. And you show them that you love them. And the best way, I can tell you from experience and from conversations with Black brethren, that hospitality you show bringing them into your home is a huge thing for them. It is. It's for all of us, not just Black brethren. It is for all of us. It's a level of trust and a level of love. It is, and I think that is something that's missing in our fellowship is going out to McDonald's for lunch on Sunday afternoon is not the same thing as you coming into my home. Yeah. Those are 2 different things radically.
And there's a little slight caveat you can include that you'll begin to recognize that their families aren't really that different than your families. Because you're all families. Like you got all the different kind of issues, struggles, strife, communication issues, love. Yeah. And I'll just kind of throw Shane in front of this. Shane's got a great comment. I'm going to drop it up here in a second. Shane and I, even further than Terry and I, had experiences of distance that could not have been mended, in my estimation, without both parties being willing to just sit down and say, what's actually going on here?
Yeah.
And it's a testament to Shane that his character is so genuine in that area. So he's probably like, stop it. Stop talking about me.
Dude, I could tell you when Shane and I had that conversation, which was years ago, you've heard this story. I mean, we're sitting at a Chinese buffet, which is so stereotypical for 2 guys like Shane and myself. And by the way, it was our goal, by the way. It was $10 and we wanted to get $20 out of that $10 bill. But we had that conversation. Hey, I want to know what's going on. And it wasn't as soon as it should have been. But I think that's one of those things where you've got to have those conversations. When you find yourself and Shane and I weren't even at odds. We never had an issue. Yeah, no more food for you. Shane and I had always had a great relationship, but there was this question, right? Talk about it. Fantastic conversation. And I learned more from Shane, which is always the case, than Shane learned from me in the process of that. I learned some valuable stuff from Shane in that conversation that has helped me out for a long time since then. But it was because we're willing to have that conversation. And you and Shane are where you're at today for a lot of reasons, but part of it is you're willing to have that conversation. And that's the key to this. You have the conversation when you disagree.
You don't have to get upset about stuff like you feel like we got to fix it today.
No.
Here's another aspect of it I think is really important is that every bridge you burn when you're young may never be rebuilt.
Correct.
And young preachers, when your zeal is driving your behavior, you may not see that. But there's going to come a day when you look back and reflect and you go, what did I lose because that bridge wasn't there? And what did they lose because I burnt the bridge? Well, you lost each other. You can't control all of those things. And this is the application of the biblical principle of the intent or desire to be at peace with all men. You can do that while sustaining your zeal for truth, being compassionate, being mindful of the challenges. You can do all those things. And we all have bad days. Generally, these bridges aren't burnt in a day. They're burnt over time and neglect.
Hal's comment earlier that many Christians would rather cry crocodile tears as people different than themselves leave over irrelevancies than broaden their minds and find a way to live together in love is really kind of poignant here, because that's one of the issues a lot of times with us is we don't want to take the time to figure out why we disagree, to have those discussions, to find out we don't disagree as much as we think we do. A lot of times what we do is we just hop churches, we just change, we just go somewhere else. We use that as a reason to divide. You've heard me talk about before. I'm in a place where we have a variety of backgrounds on the question of how the funds are used and all kinds of things. And what has made this church work is that we are willing to have discussions and find out what we can do peaceably to maintain and preserve the fellowship between all people on all sides. That doesn't mean that we all agree on everything, but it does mean that we figured out a way to have fellowship and worship together in a way that we can walk in agreement. And that's missing in a lot of places because of exactly what Hal's saying. We'd rather just split. We'd rather, and if we had figured that out years ago, there would be far fewer churches of Christ than they are currently. I mean, that's just the reality of that, because we never learned how to get along and how to live in unity, which is what we've been told to do.
Yeah, and this connects to, I'm going to get Bob's comment in a second too. I think there's a good point to that. This is the longer comment from Shane, so I'm highlighting it right now. You need to be able to reach in both directions, theologically, politically, biblically, however you want to redefine or define those principles, primarily because there's, like Shane points out, there's value in figuring out and understanding why. Why is this the conclusion that you're at? The overly simplified answer that we tend to fall back on is, oh, they just want to go sin. It doesn't matter what direction you're like, oh, they're just in the world. When in reality,
they're just worldly people.
Yeah. Sometimes the reasons why they move in a direction is because they want to avoid what they believe to be spiritual rebellion and sin. Like they're moving that way because they're like, I don't want to do this thing that I'm firmly convinced that God says don't have me do. So I'm going to move my spiritual focus to match that. And understanding that helps you gather that idea.
A good example of that is actual American politics. I think there is this thought by Republicans that the people who don't vote Republican just want to create a sinful world where abortion and homosexuality are celebrated. But if you take time to talk to somebody who doesn't vote Republican, you're going to find out a lot of time that's not the case at all. They see those as issues oftentimes that are non-reversible, and yet there are other issues such as how you take care of people who are less fortunate than you that they find to be important and reversible at the time. And you may disagree with that ideology on their standpoint, but what you need to understand is they have a spiritual reason often for what they are doing. And we automatically discredit them because we don't have the conversation. And that's on us. We shouldn't do that. Again, you may disagree with them, and that's okay. But it is wrong for you to falsely accuse them of something as their motivation because you never took the time to find out. And I think that's a key.
The same is true if you move to the Democratic side of the context. Is those Democrats, they just want a free ride. Like you're voting it because you're lazy. Like,
right.
Okay. Like you've never met a lazy Republican before. Like that's a thing. That is one of the challenges that preachers also face in this same space. Like, how do we then move to a position in our preaching that pushes towards heaven and not towards the box office, not towards the ballot box, not towards the bank? These are real fundamental principles that come into how we write the sermon. How we write the class, how we script the questions we'll ask for the conversation we want to have, which is a great point that
sometimes what sermon you even preach, like not even how you write it, but sometimes the topic itself is motivated by that, Phil. Like I think that's the other thing is like sometimes you see things and there's this huge diversity. You've got to address that,
Yeah.
not because it has to be addressed.
And kind of like what Bob was saying earlier, we and Hal kind of agrees with this too, as this talks about how he processes some of this. How do we approach the dialogue we need to have in order to expand what we're willing to discuss? Um, and here's some balance to that. Is kind of important. There are biblical truths in the idea that some conversations should be censored. There's an obligation of leadership to make sure that the conversations are guided in biblically healthy ways. For modern parlance, you don't want any toxic discussions. That's a role for leadership that includes elders, and by association, evangelists should obviously already know this. That being said, it's very easy then to tighten the rope too tight and stifle off conversation that's needful. Um, and you got to have that mindset that says, these are the questions that I want to discuss. And the conclusion that I want to reach is unity. So how do we get there? Can we? You may not get there today. You may get there in a little bit of time. There's another way to frame this whole picture. And this is something that we all, I think, would be helpful to add into our perspective. When you see an 18-year-old, you can see one of two ways in that picture. You can see how they are or how they will be. 18-year-old individual may be doing everything right, but they're still not completely formed. They might have all the right associations, done well academically, be involved in the work of the local church, morally good, spiritually good, ethically good, all those good work ethic things. But if you don't see how they could be, but only see how they present themselves to you as they are, this is the challenge of preaching, because your preaching is supposed to help them sustain what is good and reach to whom they will be. This is the challenge of politics and preaching. How do we deal with a world that's so broken, and our brethren are broken too, and help them not only see who they are, but also see who they can be? And I think that sometimes requires us to push back on areas of the status quo that will make everybody uncomfortable.
It's interesting that Hal used the idea of the hand grenade into relationships. And one of the things I've learned from that, Phil, is when we burn that bridge or throw the hand grenade into the relationship and destroy it, I've lost any opportunity I've had previously to try to teach that person whatever it is I think that they're wrong on. I've destroyed the opportunity to actually help them be right if I think they're really wrong. I mean, I think that's also something you've got to really think about how you handle these situations. In the past, when I started preaching, I don't know about you, but it seemed like one of our biggest focuses was purging the church to make sure the roll was clean, the roster was clean, pure.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process, we left a lot of people kind of abandoned on what the truth was. Kind of just, and that plays a role here. You got to handle these situations in a way you have an opportunity to actually teach somebody what is right, instead of constantly just being concerned with, this idea of showing everybody what's wrong.
Right. If the only biblical discipline that a church engages in takes place in the 6 months when the new preacher arrives, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And if you can't see that that's a problem, then unfortunately you may also be part of the problem.
Yeah.
That's the softest way that I can put that. So Terry and I will probably address more of this going forward. There's some nuances to this that we certainly could not cover today. And if you feel uncomfortable, good. That's sometimes how life is. Life's uncertain. We've got to most certainly deal with these subjects in a way that's healthy to the development of the church, but most importantly for our purpose here, help us develop as preachers to be more effective in the kingdom. Like in the end, that's the goal. I want to be as effective as I can in the kingdom. Evangelists should have that kingdom focus. It's easy for us to become entrenched in a tribe, a space, a setting, but we've really got to push it out farther.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that Paul is such a great illustration of, that as much as he was tied to local churches and loved them deeply, man, his kingdom focus really makes it seem like I need glasses and I can't see well at times. Like there's just something about that is just so wonderful to me. And I think all of us would do well to kind of reconsider and think about it sometimes. That's it for today, Terry. Last thoughts for you? I think I've blurbed on enough.
No, I'll throw this out there. Released today was a podcast with Adam Shanks. His podcast is called Preach Impediments. I joined him on that to talk about disfellowshipping, church discipline, and we kind of connected to that a little bit today in a weird sort of way, unintentionally, I think. But just look up on Facebook or on your podcast stuff, Preach Impediments, and give that a listen. It's good conversation, I think, and maybe one that you'll find beneficial.
Yeah. I'll comment about BJ's thing in a second. I have a little bit of tangential knowledge of those experiences, but I'm going to let his comment also just stand as it is. But before I do that, I wanted to plug Bobby Blackburn, who Terry and I know, you can go to his personal page or his work page. There's a workshop that he is involved in hosting that is dealing specifically with churches, ministers, and taxes. It'll be qualified individuals speaking, CPAs with deep knowledge of this particular space. And I want to encourage those who preach that this principle remains true. If you want expertise on language, you go to a language expert. If you want expertise in any other field of life, you go to an expert. So if you want expertise on how a preacher's taxes should be handled, while advice from other preachers is valuable and useful, and you can learn from those good experiences and bad experiences, at some point in that process, you need to sit down with someone who really understands the tax code as it is relevant to local churches and ministers, because it's very likely you're setting yourself up for some huge problems and missing out on some great opportunities. And so I'll try to drop a link to that sign up here in just a second. For BJ, having been on the experiential end of some of those same things in the same areas, because I lived and preached in that same kind of region, the pain for those kind of experiences is immense. The encouragement that comes as people help you through those troubles is also immensely good. And I know BJ's talked about this in other contexts before. Folks should reach out to BJ and talk to him about it. Like, the best thing you can do is to share the experience in a way that helps others. Thankful for BJ, thankful for Shane, thankful for all of you who have jumped in and participated today. If we could help you in some way, reach out, let us know. Love y'all. Take care.